You know, we're all told that recycling our old clothes is the key to a more sustainable closet, right? It's this beautiful promise of a circular economy. But have you ever really stopped to think about what happens after you drop that old t-shirt in a donation bin? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the complex and, honestly, often hidden world of textile recycling.
So the fashion industry is grappling with this massive waste problem, and recycling, it's held up as the big, shining solution. We're shown images like this, and it's presented as this clean, simple fix that magically turns our old clothes into new ones. But let me tell you, the reality is way more tangled than a pile of fabric scraps.
And yeah, the problem is only getting bigger. Get this, just between the year 2000 and 2015, the number of times a piece of clothing was actually worn before being tossed out dropped by a whopping 36%. Think about that. We're buying more, wearing it less, and creating these literal mountains of textile waste.
So naturally, we all look at that and think, okay, recycling, that's the solution. It seems like the obvious answer, doesn't it? But is it really that simple? Well, let's dig in and find out what's really going on behind the tag, deep inside this global supply chain.
All right, first things first, where does all this textile waste even come from? Believe me, the journey from our closets, or even the factory floor, back into a new material is, well, it's a lot more complicated than you'd probably guess.
Okay, so take a look at this. It might look like a tangled mess, and honestly, that's a perfect picture of the reality. The textile recycling value chain is this huge, complex web of different players. We're talking everyone from giant corporations to informal waste pickers. And this whole system is fed by three main streams of waste.
So the first stream is what's called post-production waste. This is all the stuff that never even makes it to a store. Picture it, fabric scraps from cutting out patterns, or even whole garments that get rejected for some defect. And get this can account for up to 15% of all the fabric used to make just one single piece of clothing. That's a lot of waste before it's even worn.
Next up is the one we're probably most familiar with, post-consumer and commercial waste. This is the stuff from our closets, the clothes you and I donate. But it's also things like linens from hotels and scrubs from hospitals. And because all this stuff is so different materials, different conditions, sorting it all is an incredibly manual, labor-intensive job.
And then there's this third one, which is kind of surprising, open-loop inputs. So when you see a tag that says recycled polyester, you probably think it came from an old fleece jacket or something, right? Well, right now, the vast majority of it, we're talking over 90%, actually comes from post-consumer plastic bottles. Yeah, water bottles, not old clothes. It's a totally different recycling loop.
Okay, so we've got a sense of the materials. But now we need to talk about the part of the story that is almost always overlooked, the human cost. Because at the very heart of this global recycling system, there are millions and millions of people, and many of them are some of the most vulnerable in the world.
Check out this number, a staggering 80%. An estimated 80% of all jobs in the global recycling sector are informal. Now, what does that mean? It means these workers aren't registered, they're not regulated, and they're not protected by labor laws. For all intents and purposes, they're invisible to the system.
And to really understand what that means on a human level, just listen to this. This quote comes from a study in Bangladesh, and it's chilling. In the city of Dhaka alone, around 100,000 women and children work as informal waste pickers, and they can earn as little as €7 a month. 7 a month. This isn't just a number on a slide. It's a full-blown human rights crisis.
So the bottom line is, this massive informal workforce creates a perfect storm for exploitation. The risks are they're across the board. We're talking forced labor, child labor, incredibly dangerous and unsanitary working conditions, and wages that are just impossible to live on. There are no safety nets, no social protections, nothing.
And the issue of child labor here is especially heartbreaking. Studies have documented kids working in sorting facilities and recycling plants in major hubs like India and Pakistan. And here's the really tragic part. Because a lot of the work is low skill, children can sometimes earn almost as much as adults. For families with absolutely no other options, that creates a terrible economic incentive to send their kids to work.
Migrant workers are another group that's extremely vulnerable to exploitation. They often get trapped by huge recruitment fees just to get the job, end up in unsafe housing, and get paid wages that are way, way below the legal minimum. And this isn't just happening in far-off places. One study in the UK found migrant workers in the waste industry earning as little as £2 an hour.
So, all of these really serious human rights issues are happening inside a system that, on top of everything, is also failing on the environmental side.
The problems go way beyond just the factory walls.
Okay, now this chart is really eye-opening. It shows the massive gap between what gets collected for recycling and what actually gets recycled. So even in a place like the Netherlands, which is pretty advanced, 40% of the textiles they collect that can't be reused just get thrown out anyway. And in Japan, that number jumps to an incredible 89%. A huge amount of this stuff just falls right through the cracks of the system.
And for the workers who are actually processing this waste, the daily dangers are just immense. I mean, think about it. They're breathing in fine dust from the shredding machines, getting repetitive motion injuries from sorting all day, and being exposed to who knows what hazardous chemicals from all the dyes and finishes, and usually without any protective gear at all. Plus, a lot of these places are makeshift warehouses, so there's a constant risk of fire.
And when the system breaks down and this stuff doesn't get recycled, the environmental damage is really severe. When textiles get dumped in landfills, they release methane, which is a super potent greenhouse gas. The chemical dyes and finishes can poison the soil and groundwater. And in a lot of places, the waste is just burned out in the open, which, as you can imagine, releases all sorts of toxic fumes into the air.
Okay, so I know this all sounds pretty bleak, and it is, but it's not hopeless. The big question is, how do we start to fix this? Well, let's turn to a potential solution, which is a framework for corporate responsibility called due diligence. Now, due diligence isn't just some corporate buzzword. It's a really important concept. It's an active process that says companies have a responsibility to identify, prevent, and fix the bad stuff, both human and environmental, that's happening in their supply chains. And that means all the way from the factory floor to the final recycling bin.
So the OECD actually breaks this down into some pretty clear, actionable steps. First, companies have to figure out their potential impacts. Then, they need to look at their own policies and see if they're actually working. After that comes a hard look in the mirror. How are our business practices part of the problem? And finally, and this is the crucial part, they need to engage with other players and work together to build the power to make real change.
And this slide lays it out perfectly. It's a before and after for business practices. On the left, you see how companies contribute to the risks. For example, designing clothes with complex blended fibers that are basically impossible to recycle. But on the right, you see the solution, design for disassembly, using simple single materials. Or how about this one? Instead of putting so much price pressure on manufacturers that they cut corners on waste, you actually factor the cost of proper waste handling into your pricing. It's a practical roadmap for how to do things better.
But here's the thing, and it's really important. No single company can fix this alone. These problems are systemic. They're baked into the way the industry works. Real change means building leverage together. That means partnering with other companies, setting clear expectations for everyone up and down the supply chain, and, this is a big one, actively supporting efforts to formalize the informal sector so that those workers finally get the rights and protections they deserve.
And all of this really brings us to our final big question. The goal of a circular economy, of closing the loop, is an amazing and powerful idea. But as we get better at engineering a system that's circular for materials, we have to stop and ask ourselves, are we also designing a system that is just for the people? Are we creating a loop that's not just sustainable, but also fair and safe for the human beings who make it all possible? That, I think, is the real challenge ahead of us.